This is Francesca Gino, a top behavioral scientist at Harvard University who last month was accused of data fraud. The allegations of data fraud came from 4 blog posts on the blog Data Colada. In each of these posts, the Data Colada team went through a different paper of Francesca Gino's, and by analysing Gino's dataset, they were able to, at least in my opinion, convincingly show evidence of data fraud. Now, some of these papers were very high profile, being some of the most famous experiments in the field of behavioral science. So when this news broke, it completely shocked the world of behavioral science and I think just academia in general. If the allegations against Gino are true, this is one of the most egregious cases of data fraud we've ever seen in the world of academia. And it's fair to say that at this point in time, Francesca Gino's reputation is, well, in the sewer. So, as a result, Gino is suing Harvard and the team at Data Colada. She claims the allegations against her are false, the investigation into her was unfair, and her punishment from Harvard was unjust. So to compensate her for her loss of future revenue and for the emotional distress that the whole affair has caused her, she wants $25 million. So in this video, I'm going to break down her lawsuit for you. This lawsuit is 100 pages long, but having read it all, I think I can break it down into 6 simple sections. First is simply providing context for the whole situation. So if you're new to this case and you didn't watch my previous video, don't worry, you're going to get all the context in a second. And the next 5 sections are essentially 5 different arguments that Gino and her counsel are presenting in defense of her case. Do I think that any of these arguments are particularly convincing? Not really, and I'll explain why that's my opinion for each one as we go along. So according to the lawsuit, our story starts in July 2021, when the authors of Data Colada approach Harvard Business School and tell them that they have evidence that Francesca Gino has committed data fraud. Apparently, the Data Colada team then threaten Harvard Business School with publishing this evidence on their blog, which they know will destroy the reputation of Francesca Gino and, by association, severely damage the reputation of Harvard. So in response to this, the dean of Harvard Business School, a guy called Dean Data, very appropriate name, negotiates a deal with the Data Colada team to let Harvard first do their own independent investigation into Gino in order to validate the findings of the Data Colada team before they publish it out to the public. All of this was agreed upon without telling Gino anything, and so that's exactly what happened. Over the next 18 months, Harvard Business School did an independent investigation into Francesca Gino, and at the end of the investigation, not only did they validate Data Colada's findings, but they actually found that the extent of the data fraud was even greater than what the Data Colada guys found. So in response to this confirmation from Harvard's own review, Dean Data of Harvard Business School essentially fires Francesca Gino.
You're fired.
He puts her on administrative leave without pay, relieves her of all of her research and teaching duties, and strips her of her professorship title. And we all know what happened next. Last month, Data Colada published their 4 articles talking about Francesca Gino. These articles immediately go viral amongst the behavioral science community, and quickly the story gets picked up by many major news publications as well. For example, The Guardian, which is a slightly left-leaning publication, had the title "Harvard Professor Who Studies Honesty Accused of Falsifying Data in Studies." But coverage of the story from the left was generally sparse, which means that this story could have been a blind spot for those of you who only consume left-leaning media. Instead, most of the coverage of the story was done by media publications that tend to target the right side of the political spectrum. For example, the Daily Caller, which is owned by Tucker Carlson, had the title "Harvard Scientist Who Studies Honesty Accused of Lying." And the reason why I'm able to compare different titles like that is because I have the Vantage plan with the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. Guys, it's no secret that trust in the news right now is at an all-time low. Digital news and ad-driven algorithms have made it profitable for news outlets to sensationalize their content and target specific readers based on their political views. And the worst part of all of this is that it's all hidden. And that's where Ground News comes in. Ground News is an app and website that gathers all the world's media in one place, so readers can compare coverage and see the full picture of what's being reported around the world. For every story, including this one about Francesca Gino, you'll get a quick visual breakdown of the news outlet's reporting, the political bias, and how factual the source is. And the bias and factuality ratings are all validated by 3 independent news monitoring organizations. One of my favorite features is the My News Bias dashboard. This feature lets you see how biased your news diet is. Personally, I find this kind of data playback absolutely fascinating, so if you want to try Ground News, and I highly recommend you do, go to ground.news/Pete, link in the description and in the comments, and if you use my link, you'll get 30% off the Vantage plan, which is the plan that gives you access to the My News Bias dashboard. Go check them out. Let's get back to the lawsuit. Okay, so now we're going to jump into the 5 different arguments that Gino and her counsel present in order to support her case. But to me, they sound more like excuses rather than arguments, so that's what I'm going to call them. So, Excuse number one. Excuse number one is, it wasn't me, it was a research assistant. Now, at first glance, this does seem plausible. Top professors like Gino do use research assistants to help them with their research. However, with a little bit more thought, you'll realize that this argument doesn't make any sense. Firstly, just because a research assistant handled your data doesn't mean that you're not responsible. As the principal author, you are responsible for everything that goes into that paper and that gets submitted to the journal. Just like how in the workplace, your manager is responsible for the team's output, so if somebody on the team makes a mistake, it is the manager who ultimately has to cover for it. In the same way, Francesca Gino is responsible if one of her research assistants did actually tamper with the data. And don't just take my word for it, take the word of Jay Van Bavel, another top behavioral scientist in the field, who said on Twitter about this very point, if an RA does everything from write the IRB to run the studies and analyze the data, they should be an author, likely the lead author. This is guided by ethical guidelines, e.g. the APA, which is the American Psychological Association. He then goes on to say Gino is saying she wants it both ways. She gets first authorship and most of the credit for the papers, but her legal action makes it sound like she does almost none of the work and takes none of the responsibility. The second problem with this excuse is that in the Harvard investigation, they actually interviewed some of the research assistants that Francesca Gino used. And when they asked them, has Francesca Gino ever asked you to tamper the data? Has there ever been a culture or any pressure for you to tamper the data in order to produce a certain result? They all very confidently said no, there's no pressure at all from Francesca Gino or anyone else to tamper the data. Which then begs the question, if they don't have any incentive to tamper the data, why would they? Especially if they're not even getting credited in the paper, there's clearly no incentive for them to actually want to make the results true if the results of the testing are false. So from a motivation point of view, it makes absolutely no sense that any data tampering would happen as the result of a research assistant. And finally, the biggest problem with this argument is that she literally has written on the paper that she was the one who did the data analysis. For example, in this paper called Evil Genius, How Dishonesty Can Lead to Greater Creativity, this was the subject of the third article from Data Colada. It literally says right here at the bottom under author contributions, both authors developed the study concept, contributed to the study design, collected data, and performed the data analysis. So she has literally taken credit for the data analysis in writing on the paper. I don't know how this point can remotely stand in court. So the second excuse I'm going to call, but my mates weren't suspicious though. So one of the main arguments of the lawsuit is that Harvard's independent investigation didn't take into account the testimony that they got when they interviewed Francesca Gino's lab mates and research assistants. They say that because all of her lab mates and research assistants said that they never suspected Gino and they never thought that she would do something like this, that is good evidence that Francesca Gino is innocent, and so because that evidence was largely ignored in the investigation, that means that the investigation was biased and unfair. Now, in my opinion, this is a very weak argument for several reasons. Firstly, when it comes to her co-authors, there's of course the possibility that they were in on it. After all, these co-authors have all of the same incentives as Francesca Gino, so they may have been involved in the data tampering themselves, or at the very least turned a blind eye and allowed this kind of data fraud to happen under their noses. And even if that isn't the case, and all of her co-authors are innocent, and Francesca Gino was doing this without their knowledge, how much weight should be given to witness testimony in this case? After all, when it comes to working with people, in the real world, there is an assumption of trust. That is how the world moves forward, that's how the world functions. If we were all distrusting of each other all the time, then it would make it very hard to get anything done because we'd have to be checking each other constantly and it'd be very hostile and unpleasant. So of course, in the workplace, there's an assumption of trust, there's an assumption of integrity amongst co-authors, so they have no reason to be suspicious of Francesca Gino for the same reason they have no reason to be suspicious of any of their other co-authors. So just because all of her lab mates said that they weren't suspicious of Francesca Gino, that isn't really very strong evidence that Francesca Gino is innocent. She could have been doing all of this under the guise of their trust and just doing it in her own office behind closed doors. And on top of that, thanks to the research of people like Elizabeth Loftus, we know that witness testimony is just super unreliable anyway. So really the more important evidence is what is in the data. So I don't think it's that strange that this witness testimony was largely ignored. Not a very strong excuse to me. Okay, so the third excuse from Gino is, you can't do this to me, you're being sexist. Now this one I was kind of expecting from Gino. After all, it's a very easy card to play in this scenario. Dean Data is a man, the three people who write Data Colada are all men, and so, from a very naive visual point of view, it does look bad. You have 4 men accusing 1 woman of data fraud. But just because you have men criticizing a woman doesn't mean that sexism is at play here. In order to claim the harshness of Gino's treatment was due to sexism, you either have to prove that the guys of Data Colada or Dean Data have a history of being sexist towards female researchers, or you have to prove that this treatment of Gino was especially harsh because she was a woman. And really, there's no evidence of either of those things. Now, to be fair, I don't know much about Dean Data outside of this case, but at least when it comes to the Data Colada guys, as far as I can tell from scrolling through their blog, there is no real evidence here that they tend to target women more than men. The lawsuit does try to paint a picture that they have a history of going after female researchers, pointing out a few notable examples, but just from scrolling through their blog, it seems obvious to me that the Data Colada guys go after both men and women in roughly equal amounts. And I know, as someone who's been in the industry for a while, that prior to this Francesca Gino story, the most famous article on Data Colada was about a male researcher. Now, the lawsuit tries to say that this interim policy, this special policy set up by Harvard Business School to investigate Francesca Gino, was set up in such a harsh way because she is a woman. But in my opinion, there's just absolutely no evidence of that. To me, it looks like Harvard Business School set up an especially harsh policy because the allegations against Francesca Gino are some of the worst that Harvard Business School has ever seen, probably the worst. And so to me, the response from Harvard Business School is just proportional to the severity of the allegations. Now, I can see why Francesca Gino and her counsel wanted to play the sexism card. It helps paint Francesca Gino in this sympathetic light, that she's this struggling female academic who's being targeted by all of these male bullies in the industry. But let's just recalibrate for a second and set the context for who Francesca Gino actually is. According to some sources, Francesca Gino is one of the highest paid academics in all of Harvard University, with an annual salary of over $1 million per year. On top of that, her speaking fees are between $50,000 to $100,000, and she's worked to consult with some of the biggest companies and organizations in the world. When you understand that and the amount of clout that Francesca Gino has in the industry, you realize that this isn't some poor, struggling female academic in the industry. This is an absolute behemoth of behavioral science, a multi-millionaire superstar who's being brought down by 3 relatively unknown guys who run a blog. When you put it from that perspective, who really is David and who is Goliath in this situation? I'll let you decide. Okay, so excuse number 4 is the papers are too old to have been investigated. And weirdly enough, I think this is actually the strongest argument in the whole lawsuit because it's so technical and hard to refute. So what this is referring to is a clause in the interim policy that Harvard set up to investigate Gino, which says that papers should only be investigated if they were published within 6 years of Harvard learning about the allegations of data fraud. And really, this is Harvard shooting themselves in the foot here by putting this into their own interim policy, because they should have known that 3 of the 4 papers in the Data Colada articles were actually from more than 6 years ago. However, from a non-legal standpoint, does this absolve Francesca Gino of any of these crimes? Absolutely not. It just means that she did this data fraud a long time ago and basically has a long history of doing it all the way up to 2020. Now, how will a jury respond to this? I don't know, but I know that if I was on the jury, I absolutely would not care that these papers were, technically speaking, out of scope. The main allegation on trial here is, did data fraud take place? And so for me, if I was on the jury, I really wouldn't care if these papers were written in 2012 or 2020. These are all examples of very egregious data fraud, and I wouldn't want Francesca Gino to get away with it if I was the one observing this case. That's just me, but I don't know how the jury will respond. So if that excuse was the strongest, this 5th and last excuse is probably the weakest, and that is, the study was done on paper, so there is no order to the data set. So if you haven't watched my last video where I went through the allegations in more detail, then that probably doesn't make any sense to you. So here's a clip from my last video explaining what the initial observations were by the Data Colada team. If you look at this table and specifically look at the left-hand column, the P# column, this is referring to participant ID. This is the unique ID given to each participant in a study. And as is highlighted in yellow, there are some weird anomalies in the way that this data has been sorted. Because when you look at this data, it seems obvious that this has been sorted by first the condition, so all of condition 1 are together, then all of condition 2 are together, and then in ascending order of the participant ID, which means that the numbers should consistently get bigger as you go down the line, and there should be no duplicates. Remember, each participant has a unique ID. So when you look at this data, it's a bit weird. We've got 2 49s here, that's a duplicate, that should never happen. And then at the end of the condition 1 set of participants, you have participant 51 coming after 95, then 12, then 101. Like, that sequence doesn't make any sense. And similarly, when you get to condition 2, we start with 7, then 91, then 52, then all the way back down to 5 again. And essentially what they found was that when you highlight the suspicious rows with red circles and crosses and then plot them on a graph, you can quite clearly see that the suspicious entries are the ones that are are the most extreme in favor of Francesca Gino's hypothesis. So what Francesca Gino is claiming in this lawsuit is that because this study was done on paper and then copied into an Excel spreadsheet manually afterwards, that there is no order to the data, and so you can't treat these seemingly out of order participant IDs as suspicious. Absolutely ridiculous, of course, because it just takes one look at the data set to clearly see that this data has been sorted. If I show you this screenshot, which isn't actually taken from Data Collade's article, but it's just taken from the dataset which is on the Open Science Framework, the same one that the Data Collade team used, you can clearly see that all of these participants are very neatly sorted, firstly by condition and then in ascending order of participant ID. And there's no way that you get that kind of neat ordering if there is absolutely no order to how the data was entered into the dataset. If you're randomly copying entries into the dataset, you wouldn't get it so neat like this. So to claim that there is no order to the dataset because this was written on paper first, I don't know how you can even possibly defend that. It's absolutely ridiculous. And that's beside the point, because in the Data Collade article, they were able to unpack the Excel file that this dataset was stored in. And when they did so, they were able to show that the entries in the Excel file were actually moved after the data was already imported into the dataset, and because Excel actually keeps a record of that. And so to me, this excuse really doesn't hold any water at all, because there's lots of evidence to suggest that that simply isn't the case. So does Francesca Gino actually have a case here? Kind of, but in my opinion, it's a very weak one. But I'm not a lawyer, and Francesca Gino is a multi-millionaire, so she will be able to hire some very good lawyers to defend her. So who knows what will happen if this ends up going to court. But here's the thing, I don't think it'll actually go to court. When I look at this case, to me, it seems very similar to the Hans Niemann scandal in the world of chess recently. You have a top player in the field being accused of cheating by another top player in the field and a major organization in that field, and one is suing the other two for defamation. When it came to the Hans Niemann case, and he was suing world champion Magnus Carlsen along with chess.com, that case was just dismissed in court and wasn't even brought to jury. And so I wonder if something similar will happen here. Of course, this is academia, not chess, so maybe it's a little bit more serious, I don't know. But I got a hunch that this might not even make it to court. But most importantly, win or lose for Francesca Gino, what does this lawsuit mean for the world of academia and specifically behavioral science? In my opinion, this is an awful development for academia. The incentives for whistleblowing and calling out bad actors in the industry is already catastrophically low. We saw this most poignantly in my last video where we talked about the Stanford president who had to be called out by an 18-year-old freshman at his own university. Top academics like Gino, like Mark Tessier-Levine, are able to get away with data fraud for so long because the incentive to whistleblow and call out is just so poor. And the presence of this $25 million lawsuit is only going to make that case even worse. So to me, this is an absolutely tragic outcome from the actions of Yuri, Joe, and Leif. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. Remember to go check out Ground News in the comments and in the description, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.